Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll just take a few seconds to let the room fill up with all our registrants. Perfect. I think we can go ahead and start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for taking time out of your day to join us. Welcome to the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and the Diversity Institute's webinar on inclusive human resource practices. We wanted at the beginning of this webinar to acknowledge that the city of Toronto is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The city also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. In this webinar, we will define and review inclusive practices and considerations in human resources and how they can help small and medium-sized enterprises. This session will address the impact of organizational culture on HR, challenges and barriers to inclusive HR practices, and best practices and solutions to HR challenges. I will now be introducing Dr. Wendy Souquier. Dr. Souquier is a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy at the Ted Rogers School of Management, academic director of the Diversity Institute, and research lead of the Future Skills Center. Her work on the Diversity Leads project helped shape Bill C-25 and the 50-30 Challenge. The Diversity Institute is now an ecosystem partner supporting organizations that sign up for the 50-30 Challenge, committing to gender parity and increased diversity on their boards and/or senior leadership roles. During this webinar, ASL interpretation will be provided. And should you have any questions, please know that the Q&A function should be used for any of those. I'll now be handing it over to Wendy. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much for having me and welcome everyone. And I just wanted to reiterate that I'm joining you from the traditional territory of Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, the Wendat peoples, and the Anishinaabe. And it's important to us at the university formerly known as Ryerson to embed a commitment to truth and reconciliation in everything that we do. And that's part of the reason we changed our name. So what we're going to talk about today, and we have a great panel, so I'm really going to just breeze through some highlights based on work that we've been doing at the Diversity Institute. What we really want to do today is just whet your appetite for more. And we know there are many experts who are joining us from around the province and indeed some from across the country who have really good examples of practices that they have implemented in their organizations to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm going to provide a bit of an overview to set the stage, and then the panel will dig in and share their experiences. And with famous last words, I will see if I can share my screen. And just flagging for Caitlin, please look at the chat because one of Richard's having some trouble getting in. So is that good? Thumbs up? I'm going to assume it's working. Just a bit about the Diversity Institute. And the only reason I want to do this is not so much to provide a commercial as to provide a bit of a context for the work that we're doing and for my remarks. So the Diversity Institute is in the business school at the Ted Rogers School of Management. We have over 100 full-time staff who are engaged in a wide variety of projects, all with a focus on creating inclusive workplaces, advancing equity, diversity groups in leadership roles, promoting women and diverse entrepreneurs. And while our work is obviously grounded in a commitment to social justice, we really believe, and we really think we have good evidence to support the notion that doing a good job with equity, diversity, and inclusion results in better organizational performance. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And the Ontario Chamber of Commerce has been a very important partner of ours in a whole range of initiatives, and with a real focus on providing tools and support, particularly for small, medium enterprises, which we know often do not have the full-time director of equity, diversity, and inclusion, or even a full-time human resources director, and who are, because they're running off their feet trying to keep the doors open. And we had a workshop just recently at the Metropolis Conference in Ottawa with representatives of many sectoral councils, including ICTC, including Excellence in Manufacturing, including NGen, which is the manufacturing supercluster, as well as BioTalent. And the message was very clear. Our members care about diversity and inclusion, but we have to keep our eye on the ball, which is making our business successful. And so from my point of view, one of the most important things we can do is show that those two things are connected. When we look at the situation in Canada right now, we know that there are big gaps in terms of employment and in terms of wages. And in spite of the progress women have made, for instance, every International Women's Day, we come back and say, are we there yet? And it's clear that women are still underpaid, underemployed, that stereotypes, especially in some professions, are real impediments. And we did a Google image search on the word carpenter. And what you will see is you get pictures of Jesus, you get pictures of carpenter ants, you get pictures of Karen Carpenter, which people of my vintage will remember, before you get a single picture of a woman carpenter. And those kinds of stereotypes are baked into many professions. And we do a lot of work with women entrepreneurs, and that comes out very clearly. We also know that there are barriers to employment that are deeply rooted. And when we look at the history of genocide with Indigenous peoples, for example, it has had ripple effects. And when we think about the fact that half of the Indigenous community in Canada lives in rural and remote places, mostly on reserve, where 30% do not have access to running water, where they have to travel out of town to attend high school, and so on and so on and so on. It's not surprising that we still see underrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. We still see egregious stories of discrimination, even in healthcare, against Indigenous peoples. When we look at who's at the top of organizations, and this has been really encouraged by a number of organizations like Black North, and probably some on the call have signed the Black North Pledge. But when we look at the representation of women on boards, in leadership roles, and so on, we see they're underrepresented. When we look at racialized women, we see that white women outnumber them 12-1 in the GTA. And when we look at the top 100 paid 100 CEOs in Canada, we see that there are 4 women and exactly 4 men named Mark. So there's a long way to go, even with women, and with many of the other equity deserving groups, there are even bigger barriers. And then we look at issues around occupational segregation, which is the tendency of certain occupations to attract women versus men, certain occupations to attract people from the Black community and so on. And we know that that contributes. I mentioned at the beginning, and I apologize, many of you have heard me say this over and over and over again, but I do think it warrants repeating, and that is that the case for diversity is very tightly coupled with business goals and objectives. And right now, we've heard repeatedly from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce that talent is one of the key competitive advantages. That we know that there are 1 million unfilled positions across Canada. We know a lot of that is a result of demographics, but it's also a result of employers perhaps hiring in their own image or hiring the way that they have always hired and not tapping into new pools of talent. We also know markets are changing because demographics are changing. And so there are new opportunities for products and services. And even where you're in a B2B environment, we know that a lot of tier 1 suppliers are now thinking very carefully about equity, diversity, and inclusion because their customers are asking tough questions. And that's creating new opportunities around procurement, for instance, for organizations that get this right. We know all the evidence supports the fact that, having more diverse people encourages creativity and innovation. There's lots of evidence to support that. And, given that we're focusing on HR, it's also important to recognize the increasing focus we're seeing on inclusive workplaces as part of a healthy, welcoming environment that will both help you attract and retain employees. And we see more and more transparency. If you look at some of the job posting sites, there's a lot more feedback on company work environments than there ever was before. And if that's not enough, of course, there are issues around legal and reputational costs. So we ground what we do very much in what organizations need in order to be successful. And we believe that equity, diversity, and inclusion is part of that. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail because the team will send copies of the presentation out as part of the follow-up. And so, we can go through, and some of the panelists have particular experience with research. I certainly hope Rupa Banerjee, who's going to chair this session, will share the results of some of the work she's done. But we know that there are ongoing problems with the recognition of credentials, with access to social networks. We know that there's still a lot of informal hiring in Canada where people, especially in small, medium enterprises, where people rely on who they know to recommend employees, and so on and so on. And just as a reminder, and again, I've talked about this in the past, we know that gender is still an issue. We know that there's still differences between men and women and their experiences in the workplace. And if you dig in on tech sector, it becomes very, very obvious that even issues around harassment and certainly microaggressions remain problems that women face often on a daily basis. But what's important about this slide is just to underscore that the differences between the experience of men and women in the workplace are not nearly as large as the differences between people who are white and people who are racialized. And if we dig in deeper and look specifically at the experiences of people who are Black, the gap is even greater. And so it's just important to continually remember that there's lots that we need to do. And even within the group that is called racialized, now this is old, we would see differences with Chinese immigrants today because of the horrific increase in anti-Asian racism, hate crimes, and so on during the pandemic. But this just again shows the experiences with discrimination are greater for some groups than they are for others. And of course, we know the stories of underemployed engineers, underemployed physicians, at a time when we have shortages of engineers, shortages of physicians, shortages of nurses, and so on. And one stat that for me was particularly instructive was a comparison of Canada and Australia. And what it showed was that immigrants to Australia 5 years out earn 90% of what someone born in Australia earns. And that's whether they're doctors, engineers, accountants, you go through the occupational groups. In Canada, 5 years out, immigrants earn 50% of what Canadians born people earn. And that applies for doctors and so on. And when you get to something like dentists, it's 25%. So we have barriers. We cannot deny. The evidence is clear. Some of them are systemic, some of them are in regulated professions, and some of them also have to do with practices in organizations, including HR. And we know there's bias there. There's bias in the way jobs are designed. There's bias in the way we think about what qualifications are required. There's bias in who we reach out to and where we recruit. There's bias in how we make selections. And it isn't intentional. It's often just because the way that we have always done things. And there are also issues around unconscious bias, which are increasingly coming to the fore. And Rupa Banerjee was the author of one of these studies, which showed if you have a foreign sounding last name, you're much less likely to get called for interview than if you have an Anglo-Saxon sounding last name. Again, I've shared this before, but I'm going to share it again because for me, it's the most horrifying data point that we have. And what this shows is that university graduates with severe disabilities have worse employment outcomes than high school dropouts. And if you think about what it takes to get through university, particularly if you have a severe disability, it's pretty obvious to me you should be able to get a job. And so we think that there is evidence that employers, because of their practices, because of the lack of resources, because of the concerns about bringing people in that don't have a connection to the business. When you're only hiring 1 or 2 people a year, those hires become absolutely fundamental. And so often small business owners are much more comfortable hiring people who've been recommended by people that we know. But as a result, they're missing out on opportunities. As a result, we find that people often are the only one of their kind in an organization, and therefore leave as quickly as they come because they don't feel included. So when we think about what needs to change, we do take a systems view. We know that part of the issue is societal. We know that even small businesses that want to hire immigrants face challenges with recruitment processes and navigating the landscape that's required to bring in internationally educated professionals, for example. We know that policies and processes still present barriers. We know that often it's easier to do what you've always done than try something new. But we still believe that organizations can change practices and can get great results. And finally, at the end of the day, all of this comes down to individual choices we make as individuals. And I'm not going to talk about this in great detail, but we also have lots of tools for supporting people's growing awareness of where bias occurs, how to combat it, how to deal with microaggressions, and choices that we can make on a daily basis to be allies and to erode some of the barriers. So I've already talked about a lot of this, and I know that I'm always pushing the limits in terms of time. So I think just to again underscore that there are issues at the societal level that really require coordinated effort to change, including policies, including challenging stereotypes, and so on. And I'm really proud, frankly, of Rocco Rossi, the CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, who was one of the first business leaders who said very clearly, childcare is not a women's issue, it's an economic issue. And I know the OCC has played a really important role in promoting opportunities for women and developing tools to help organizations hire persons with disabilities, and in eroding barriers for newcomers and so on. So just a bit of a shout out to the OCC for their work here. OCC has also signed on to the 50-30 challenge, which is a voluntary pledge to increase, to commit to gender parity, 50% women or non-binary people, and increased representation of equity deserving groups. So that's Indigenous peoples, that's racialized people, particularly those who are Black, persons with disabilities, and those who identify as 2S LGBTQ+, on boards and or in senior management roles. And we've had a couple of sessions talking about the 50-30 challenge, but as Mohammed Elmi, my executive director, recently said, you can't change who's in the boardroom unless you change who comes in the door. You can't change who's at the top of the organization unless you have inclusive practices all the way through the organization. And that's why HR is important. Some of you have heard me say before that equity, diversity, and inclusion should not just be an HR issue. And I believe that very strongly. I believe we have to bake it in to the supply chain, and to everything that organizations do, and that ideally an EDI strategy is simply part of the corporate strategy. Nevertheless, HR is often where the rubber hits the road, and along with corporate culture, which is shaped by policies as well as leadership, we really still have quite a lot of work to do. The good news is there are lots of tools and lots of supports available, including best practices, including examples of how to write a policy, how to write a job description, and so on, that we can make available. So I just wanted to hit some highlights around things that we'll be discussing in more detail. Recruitment. Thinking about recruitment in a new way, thinking about whether or not you have targeted strategies for reaching out to equity deserving groups, being sure that your job postings don't include qualifications that simply are not necessary. And a lot of leading organizations are really reconsidering what they list as credentials and qualifications, because they know that they can present barriers. And we have lots of examples of how to do this well. Making sure that you're considering a range of channels. You know, if you're advertising nobody does this anymore, I know, but you know, if your principal source of advertising used to be the Globe and Mail, you were reaching a very limited pool of potential applicants. Many progressive organizations forge partnerships with, for example, immigrant serving organizations, with organizations like Black Business Professional Association and so on, not just to help with their recruitment for staff, but also with their procurement requirements. Making sure your selection processes don't have embedded bias. Interviews, quite frankly, are the worst way to select people. They give you some insight, they give you some information, but psychopaths do really well in interviews because they'll tell you exactly what you want to hear. And there's lots of evidence that, especially for people coming from other cultures, the interview process can be very alienating. And many of the things that are baked into those processes are in fact biases that prevent people from finding the right talent. And one example not of interviewing, but of recruitment, I think I mentioned in a previous session, but I'll mention again, was in Kingston, an SME had no applicants. They were getting ghosted for a very important role. They added one line to their job ad. It said, internationally educated professional applicants welcome. They doubled the number of applicants. They got much, much better candidates, and they ended up with people who not only came but stayed. And so there are lots of examples we can provide you of cases where this has really helped. Making sure that your assessment processes are fair and unbiased, making sure that the people making decisions understand how bias can creep into those decisions and are trained. And I've seen lots and lots and lots of cases, even at a university, where people unintendedly reveal that, you know, they would prefer a white man over a racialized woman who has 3 times the qualifications and experience, because they tend to be biased towards the potential of men versus, and put a very heavy burden on the track record of women. And certainly when we look at promotion, we know that women are less likely to put their names forward, and that's true of other underrepresented groups as well. And so you need to have a very intentional strategy around promotion. And if people are leaving, and we hear this a lot, oh, we hired one and they left, you need to understand why. So baking in questions about why people are leaving the organization is really important. And we have lots and lots of examples of best practices we're more than happy to share. And I'll just end by saying thank you very much for participating, and we hope we have an opportunity to continue the conversation. Thanks so much. And back to you, Samir. Or maybe over to Rupa.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Wendy.
Sorry, I missed my notes. So I have to introduce at this stage my colleague, Rupa Banerjee, who is the Canada Research Chair at in Immigration, Employment, and Entrepreneurship. She's a very well-recognized expert in issues of diversity and inclusion, and in fact was one of the co-authors of that seminal study I noted that showed how bias is baked into processes. So Rupa is going to lead the panel, and I am going to hand it over to her now.
Thanks so much, Wendy. So today's session is really focusing on the challenges that SMEs face in trying to ensure that HR processes are inclusive. And, Wendy mentioned some of the research that we've done looking at, bias in the hiring process in particular. And so one of the things that was really remarkable in our findings was that small businesses actually exhibit more discrimination in terms of not calling back applicants with a foreign sounding name relative to bigger businesses. And so, that was a really interesting kind of revelation, but in many ways was not surprising. So SMEs face a unique set of barriers and a unique set of challenges when it comes to trying to ensure that their practices are inclusive. So we're very lucky today to have 3 experts with lots and lots of experience on inclusive practices within SMEs. So what I want to do first is just give an opportunity to each of my panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about themselves. So we'll start with Pascal. Pascal, if you could just introduce yourself, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Rupa. Thank you for having me. So I'm Pascal Alpha, Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at CAE. And I've been in this position now for a year, but before that, I was co-leading Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at CAE from its beginning, so about 2018. And everything I do in my position is to foster, promote a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion across the organization, where everyone feels like they belong, where they can contribute to the best of their abilities to be themselves, with no exception. And CAE, just for those who don't know, we're a global company. We have, we're not an SME, but we, I think the experience that we have, can serve the people listening. But CAE is a global company. We have about 13,000 employees in 40 countries. Everything we do is about making the world safer. So we're mostly known for our flight simulators, for our training centers where we train the world's pilots. And our industry is aviation, as well as defense and security, healthcare, basically very male-dominated industries. So I'm very proud that we went from 18% women when we started DNI, our DNI journey a few years ago, to 23% today. So good improvement, and even better in terms of our leadership positions. And now we're broadening our scope to other underrepresented groups, more broadly, visible minorities, indigenous community, LGBTQ, etc. And just one last thing, I'm an immigrant. I've lived in the Arab world most of my youth, and I understand what it's like not to be part of the majority. And, I'm doing this because I believe that what we're doing for diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to make us uncover a lot of hidden talent within, our company and outside. And that's why I'm sharing that. I'm very proud to share what we have done. And one last thing that I wanted to mention, listening to Wendy, was why are we doing this at CAE? Because, studies have shown that diverse and inclusive organizations outperform their peers. They are more profitable, they're more innovative, they bring better decisions. And of course, there's talent, attraction. Of course, it's the right thing to do. But I wanted to point that out as well from a business perspective, that it's very important. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pascal. I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia to give a quick introduction.
Hello, folks, and thank you for having me today. My name is Cynthia Dorrington. I'm president of Vail & Associates. It's a small consulting firm that really focuses on strategy. And strategy, I see it as not just an organizational strategy, but really the people strategy, because the organization does not have any life or breath without its people. So understanding people, and most importantly, how people navigate the workforce, how they come in, how they are successful within the workforce, and how they retire. So a whole stream of EDI is critical for the success of the organization. But this is really around policy and inclusive policies around recruitment. And I think as we go through and answer some of the questions that have been posed to us, I think it really is an understanding of the organization itself and how organizations start. And I think once we get to the root of how organizations start, that's why we can actually have these discussions around inclusive employment or recruitment, because sometimes an organization doesn't start off as being inclusive. It forms inclusion, it moves that way. But we have to understand the root of the organization does not start with inclusion at the forefront or at the root of the organization. So I'm glad we're having this discussion today.
Thanks so much for joining us, Cynthia. And finally, Richard, if you could please introduce yourself, that would be wonderful.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Sharp. I'm currently the director of the Black Equity Branch of the Treasury Board Secretariat at the Ontario Public Service. I'm a longtime public servant. I worked in the federal public service for more than 26 years and left recently to take on this exciting opportunity to change the world within the OPS. I have been doing this work, however, anti-racism work, specifically, for more than 30 years. I understand very well the legislation that underpins most of what we do, and I have been able to translate that into something that's a bit more real for people, much to the chagrin of leaders within the federal public service and elsewhere who would like to maintain sort of performative activities around addressing the rights of people, the participation of different peoples in their workforces. So happy to be here today. I know we don't have a lot of time, but very happy to engage in this conversation.
Thanks so much, Richard. So in addition to being the moderator, I will also be the time czar. So I apologize if I, at some point, wave at you to say we're going to move on to the next question, but we do want to leave a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. So my first question is for Cynthia. So Cynthia, in your work with SMEs and startups, what do you see are the most common gaps in inclusive HR practices, and how these growing companies really manage the changing landscape of EDI?
I think when I work with SMEs, especially startups, it's because the organization started because they had an idea or they have a passion. And they come in together. Typically, they're friends or groups of people that are coming together with the same idea and passion. They're not looking at the makeup of the group, and they're moving forward to try to fulfill on what they want to achieve as an organization. But as the organization starts to grow, when we come into challenges with people coming on board, what recruitment practices look like, the retention, that all focuses on the fact that as you start off, you don't start off with a strong base of policies and practices. At times you start off because you love what you do. HR is an aspect of the organization, but it's not what you do. It's how you do it, how you bring people in to do it. So they're looking at the totality of how I'm going to get my product and or service out. And I'm not really looking at the people I bring in or how I bring them in or who I'm bringing in or what issues I'm looking at. And most importantly, as SMEs, we don't always look at that legislation component behind it, which is critical for our success, which is the labor codes, the Human Rights Act and legislation around human rights, occupational health and safety. All of those lend to actually forming a great foundation for an organization to drive inclusion, because ultimately what you're starting to do, you're starting to understand that there are barriers within an organization if you don't do things right. So policies are the first thing when I'm brought into a small business that has issues. It's around policies, and a lot of those policies are around inclusive policies, around recruitment, and they have a challenge because people are leaving. And once you go do the analysis, you realize that there are some aspects of your recruitment because you're doing word of mouth hiring. There are aspects that you're not being inclusive enough. Your outreach strategy is not there. As a result, you're bringing in people that look more like you, and you're not being inclusive in that perspective. And remember, diversity in thought and ideas actually lends to having people that don't always look like you in the workforce, because that ends up having the totality of a great product being produced or serviced. But at the same time, I think that a lot of people, I will honestly say SMEs don't know what they don't know. And recruitment is not, unless they are in a recruitment firm, recruitment is not their be all and end all. It's something they do because they want to grow. It's not something they always do well. So I think it's really getting in there early, putting in those practices, putting in the policies, and then actually doing the training. Policies, practices in without the training and the follow-up and the guiding is not going to be successful either. So I think it's really understanding how organizations grow. And when I'm brought in, it's typically when they have issues with people leaving the organization or conflict in the organization, which means the culture is not established yet. And some of that comes from understanding how you start to grow and how you start building that culture. And that starts at the leadership level on down.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Cynthia. And thanks for being so concise with your answer. I really appreciate that. Okay, so kind of building a little bit on what Cynthia was talking about, I'm going to turn it over to Pascal. So we know that EDI is an important part of company culture. So, the culture affects retention. It affects how happy people are within the organization and whether they stay ultimately. So how can SMEs build and sustain a company culture that actually promotes EDI?
Absolutely. I think it really, really makes me proud because when employees come to me and say that they chose to come to CAE because we are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They see it on our website, they see it in social media, they see that it's part of our culture. And it's an attraction, and as well, it has helped our company be more open, be more fun, because we celebrate diversity, and it helps, our employees feel that they, we help them, unleash, their full potential because they are able to be themselves. They feel that they're leaders, that the company is proud to have them on board, as they are. So that's the objective in the terms of the culture, to make people feel that they belong, And once you do that, they will have a better performance. They will be more innovative. They're going to be, the teams will be more strong because they're going to be more diverse, and there's going to be this exchange. So how do you create this culture that promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion? It has to be part of your values. So that's what we did 5 years ago, no more, 7 years ago. When we started, we wanted, actually engagement wasn't very high, and we wanted to evolve our culture, and we reviewed our values and we came up with 5 values, bottom down. And one of them, the center value, is 1 CAE. And 1 CAE is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's about the differences, bringing all our differences together as one, and and working as one company. And so basically, we embrace this diversity to create an environment where all employees are valued, they feel safe. We promote the well-being by focusing on recognition, by focusing on development and having fun. And another really important thing in creating this culture is the leadership, and since I mentioned it, leadership from the top. So when we started our initiative, we had actually all our top leaders together in a workshop working on, how can we plan this diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are your ideas? And they, we had their buy-in. And today our CEO is really a driving force to help us from a D&I perspective. And we actually put it in the strategy of the company. It's in there. There are objectives. The CEO even has objectives in terms of diversifying the leadership team as well. And the leaders are also they're each one of our senior leaders is a sponsor of our employee resource group. So they're really embedded in what they do. Another really important thing I think that I really would like to mention is communications. I have a communications background, and when I was co-leading D&I before having it full time, I could see the power of communication. So what do we do at CAE? We celebrate and we highlight all the important dates to showcase diversity and inclusion. So International Women's Day, Black History Month, Pride Month, and it doesn't mean that you only focus on those days. We do it all year round, but I think for me, I think it's important to do it. So for instance, today is World Down Syndrome Day. And so we asked our employees to wear mismatched socks and show colorful socks and share them, on our intranet. And that helps raise awareness about autism. So that's just an example. And there's so many other examples. So another important thing, if I may continue, is our employee resource groups. So they multiply the strength of our message. And they're, the leaders of these employee resource groups are really great allies for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So for instance, Joe, who's the leader of our employee resource group for women in aviation, he used to be a fighter pilot. And she talks about, working in the male environment and brings that subject up. There's Nancy, who has an autistic child, and she's the leader of our employee resource group for people with disabilities. And she talks about how her manager supported her when her child was young. And now her child actually works at CAE. So these are just, great stories that you get your employees to be participating in these employee resource groups, and they're going to help you, bring more awareness about diversity and the importance of it. Same thing with last month was Black History Month. We had a panel with our employees, and they shared personal stories about what it's like to be, the only Black person in a team. And again, these are things that, when you're part of the, majority, you don't know, and it makes you aware. It's from an HR perspective. So I would say, check your HR policies and practices to make sure that they're free of bias. Benefits and compensation, they were like a game changer for us at CAE. We launched lately a whole series of benefits that touch D&I. So for instance, global flexible vacation, parental leave, we extended our maternity leave, we have a sabbatical. These were very important. I feel I'm taking a lot of time, but I'm just gonna do one more thing.
Absolutely.
So employee development, what we do as well is we make sure that our high potential employees have access to development. So for instance, there's something called the IFEA or Ambition Challenge. So we register some of our top women in there. They come out of it, more confident. They learn, self-confidence, risk-taking, negotiating, skills that are important. And what we're doing, we also establish targets. So for instance, we make sure that in our high potential employees, that we have diversity, that you have at least 30% are women. And now we're looking at other diverse groups to make sure that it is diverse from, all perspectives. What else can I tell you? The last thing I will say is creating, the most important thing is once you bring that diversity is to create that inclusive environment. So what we're doing, for instance, is having some training on microaggressions. What are microaggressions? What do you do if you hear one? We also starting an allyship program for men. How can we get men involved to support diversity? How can, and involving them from the beginning, so in the whole idea of, in the plan itself. And finally, in our town halls, when we talk about with our employees, one of the things we say, we remind them how each person can be more inclusive. So for instance, be open, open to others, listen to what others are saying, be empathetic. When you're in a meeting, make sure that everybody's voice is heard, that everybody speak up if you hear, an issue, make sure that you're creating the safe space for people. And, when you're working on a project, create diverse teams. So these are some of the things that we are doing, and there's so much more. I just feel that I've taken a lot of time already.
No, those are very, very helpful and very practical suggestions that you've given, Pascal. So I really appreciate that. So Richard, my next question is for you. I know that you've developed and revitalized a lot of employee-driven networks within the federal government. And for companies attending today that are from larger organizations or even from smaller organizations for that matter, what are some ways that they can leverage existing resources and processes to support and develop a more inclusive workplace culture, and particularly HR culture?
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time, so I might deviate a little bit from the question and impart the messages that I wanted to share, which relates somewhat to the question, because in fact, I have started a lot of groups, both inside and outside the public service, but particularly focused on the experiences and the lived realities of Black people in this country and in the federal public service. And the reason why we did that is because existing structures, mechanisms around multiculturalism, employment equity, diversity, inclusion have not worked for Black people within any institution within this country, be it private sector or federal or public sector. We find that even though we've had a number of these things in place for, I would say, about 10, 15 years or so, the lived experience, the working experience of Black people has declined and gotten worse during this period of time. So diversity and inclusion by itself does not work in terms of bringing that sort of well-being and welcoming environment and growth within an organization, specifically for Black people. So I sort of needed to make those comments because it's important to contextualize this work, right? So if something's not working and we continually have workshops and we have people who are hired to do this work within our organizations, but we're still seeing these struggles. We have events and we have activities that sort of focus on sort of bringing awareness, but we still have these inequities in terms of employment, representation, and so on, which are endemic. So a couple of things just really quick. And again, this was foundational for a lot of the work that I do. HR is probably, and the reason why I took time out to speak to this group, HR is probably one of the most important partners to ensure workplace health well-being. HR is both an enabler of these things, good things to happen in the workplace, and they're a disabler for these things to happen. And the reason why I say that they can play both those functions is because HR's principal focus, if we just break it down to its basics, HR is here to help employers do what the employer wants to do with respects to staffing, recruitment, training, labor relations, and a whole host of things that help the organization do what it wants to do. But we have to understand that HR is a reflection of our society. Management and organizations, leadership are reflections of our society. And our society, as much as we talk about being pluralist and we respect human rights and all that good stuff, what underpins the foundation of our society here in Canada, and I think Wendy's presentation highlighted this, the disparities between what happens to racialized people when they come here and do so much worse than in Australia, is that one of the founding principles and values of Canada is one that is very racist, it's one that's sexist, and it's to some extent ableist. So we have to look at the source. We have to look at the root of why these things are not working, these various initiatives are not working to actually transform organizations from what they were when Canada was formed more than a century ago to today. So if Canada is a reflection of, if workplaces are a reflection of sentiments within our society, values, where racism is a thing, right? It defines how we do our laws, our regulations, our business practices, who's in the C-suites. This is what we need to look at in terms of achieving equity, diversity, and inclusion. And if we don't do this, then we're always missing the mark. Then we're always having these conversations about the things that we are doing to try to make people feel comfortable, but we're not going to the source. So, if I am engaging with senior leadership and I'm saying you have a racism problem that is a value-based problem, racism is a core value of the federal public service. And when I say this, people get upset and they go, "Oh no, Richard, that can't be true. We love people." But when you see the practices in terms of who gets picked, who becomes deputy ministers and so on, then you have a reckoning that needs to be done. There's absolute exclusion that's happening. And where is HR to advise on these kinds of things when they know from their own data, when they do collect data, that only certain people are being put forward for applications, for opportunities. Only certain people are getting those opportunities. Only certain people are being promoted. Cases of racism and discrimination are being, put under the rug. Non-disclosure agreements so that, the organization doesn't catch too much heat when people find out how bad things are. These are the kinds of things that deny people their human rights in the workplace. And so that's where I always start. My name is Richard Sharp. And when I show up for job interviews, people look around me looking for Richard Sharp. I have a good white name. They're not looking for a black guy with dreads. That's built into our value system as to who I should be based on my name. I love what Wendy was saying. So if that is a fact, that is truth, and that many people now are saying this, and I guess the kicker for folks and for you as HR practitioners is that we're now needing to evolve and address this at its source. The activities that we do around sort of diversity and inclusion, the events and the culture days, Ramadan's coming, we're going to, try to make the Muslim people feel welcome in our workplaces, don't address the systemic institutional racism or discrimination that we have in our organizations. And if we don't do that within a country that is growing exponentially, primarily with Black and brown people, then in the future, it's not so much a business case, because I don't think organizations really care about the business case, because if they did, then we would have done these changes long before. Organizations that understand the business case for diversity are doing it. Governments and others are struggling with it because their values don't align with equity, diversity, inclusion, / human rights, anti-racism, anti-sexism work. So if we don't do this, it's not so much that we're in trouble in terms of businesses, we're in trouble in terms of peace. And I always say this, and again, some people don't like it when I say that. This is the last thing I'm going to say because I know we're going to run out of time. It's not so much that Canada is going to turn into some of these other countries where they've had racial strife and conflict burning in the streets. England, France, when they kill Black children, people get up and they cause riots and they burn things down. The United States, we saw that during the Black Lives Matter movement. Canada's a much nicer and polite place to live. So peace in Canada for me means that people want to work in the organizations where you need them to work. It means that they want to participate and buy your services. It means that they will not look to go elsewhere in terms of other countries, return back to their countries and take their skills and their children with them. If I, as a person that was born in this country, I'm looking to leave Canada so that my children have better opportunities, that we have something fundamentally wrong with how we are doing things in this country, because I am not the only one. So I think that my last thing that I will leave you with is that I think it's really important to redefine and reimagine how we do this kind of work. Diversity and inclusion has no legislation. It has no laws or legal frameworks behind it. Human rights legislation, we're now putting in place, I'm pushing to help the federal government develop anti-racism legislation. The province has done anti-racism legislation. All of these things help to underpin things that can have consequences, accountabilities, and sanctions. There are no accountabilities around whether or not people have a culture day, eat ethnic food, or wear ethnic dress in the workplace. So for me, I want to make sure that one day my kid might want to be a deputy minister and see that there's somebody that looks like him. I might be the first, but I'm going to retire in a minute, and I might not retire in this country. So I'm just saying that for folks, and I know we don't have a lot of time to explore this. I did block off some extra time so that we could continue a conversation about how we could transform EBI to be much more effective and realistic in terms of impacting the change and lives and of people that we're working with. But I think it's an incredibly important conversation. I like touching the HR community because just like back in the Ontario Public Service, I'm challenging them to do more than what they have been programmed to do, which is to be stewards of policies, processes that in many ways enable us and maintain the status quo. So thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard. I think your remarks are, absolutely on the mark, and also really touch upon the broader importance of this, rather than just focusing on the business case, which is quite narrow in many ways. So really appreciate that. Now, we've unfortunately reached 11 o'clock. I'm not sure how that happened. So I'm not sure if this is the right thing, but I don't think we have time for a question and answer period right now. But I think that we might be able to take questions through email or through a different way. So if I can ask Samir or Caitlin, if that would be an appropriate way for participants to send in questions. Okay, wonderful. So if you do have questions for any of the panelists or all of the panelists, please feel free to email. I think Hunter Reedman would be a good email to send to, or Wendy, if you can let us know where participants should email, that would be wonderful.
Yes, and I apologize for not allowing enough time for the discussion, but this, as I said at the outset, is the first in a series of sessions. There will be a follow-up email that comes out with the presentation, with links, with more information, and with questions, so you can respond in writing. And more importantly, we will schedule a follow-up session to dig in deeper on some of the best practices. So thanks all of you for participating.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks, my fellow folks.
Thank you all. Really appreciate all of your insights.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.